Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. They said it was coming, but no one listened. Climate instability had been a buzzword for years. Articles tossed around by scientists, footnotes on talk shows, whispered fears among emergency planners, but nothing ever really happened. So we cut more trees, built more cities, and treated the weather like an inconvenience, not like a warning. I'm Wyatt Braddock. I'm a lumberjack based out of Quesnel, British Columbia, a small town wedged between forests, rivers, and logging roads carved into the Canadian wilderness. I've worked the pine and spruce slopes of the Caribou Mountains for 15 years, running chainsaws in the summer and bucking frozen logs by the ton come winter. But nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for what we faced in those first 30 days. It started subtly. September rolled in colder than usual, with hard frosts hitting the valley a good 3 weeks ahead of schedule. The locals chalked it up to a bad year. Quesnel's not unfamiliar with cold. Average lows dip below -10 degrees Celsius in winter, and we've seen freak storms before. But this was different. The air felt heavy, like it wasn't just colder, but deader, less moisture, less give. I was working a job about 40 kilometers northwest of town, near the Blackwater River Basin. We'd been contracted to clear beetle-kill lodgepole pine, trees already drying out, already brittle from infestation. I was foreman on a 4-man crew. Ricky Groves, a chainsaw artist from Alberta with a bad back and a good heart. Ben Schreier, our loader operator and local mechanic. And Yulia Jules Kashenko, our Ukrainian-born log truck driver and chainsaw second when we needed her. On September 23rd, the sat phone signal dropped. Now, we've had blackouts and comms disruptions before. Weather, solar storms, sometimes a battery going out on the tower. But this wasn't normal. Ricky tried the backup handheld VHF to reach dispatch. Nothing. Jules even climbed up the Cat 527 skidder to get a higher line of sight. Still nothing but static. That night, we lit the burn barrel early. It was -8 degrees Celsius already, mid-September. We had layered up in our high-vis and fleece, cooked canned chili on the portable propane stove, and waited for the usual call-in window with dispatch that never came. Then, just after midnight, we saw the auroras. Now, I've seen northern lights before, but never like this. Blood-red streaks mixed with violet spirals danced over the timberline, like someone had spilled gasoline across the stars. I could see Ricky's breath fog up as he muttered something about solar flares, but none of us could take our eyes off it. The sky wasn't just dancing, it was changing. The temperature dropped fast. By 2 a.m., it was -18 degrees Celsius. Our gear started icing up just from standing outside. We heard the news 2 days later on an emergency wave picked up by a survivalist radio Jules had rigged with a marine band antenna. A broadcast from Whitehorse, Yukon. Some kind of upper atmospheric collapse, jet stream disruption, total loss of the Gulf Stream. Something about tropospheric stall. The man on the radio was calm, but his words weren't. He said that the Northern Hemisphere was entering a severe climatic plunge. An ice age. Not a metaphor, not a term. A real geophysical shift. We had to act. There was no power grid, no fuel deliveries, no resupply. On September 26th, we packed what we could into Jules's 2002 Kenworth W900. Steel chains, 60 litres of diesel siphoned from the skidders, a Ruger Mini 14 in .223 rem we kept for bear defence, 6 boxes of canned beans and soup, and about 20 MREs Ricky had brought, just in case. We made the 40-kilometre trip into Quesnel on a logging road turned to ice. The town was chaos. The gas stations were either closed or out. The grocery store had been ransacked. Power lines sagged under frost thicker than I'd ever seen. We found Ben's cousin Matt, an off-duty volunteer firefighter, guarding a pile of firewood in the back of his Dodge Ram, wrapped in 4 coats and a scarf. handing out what food he had left to neighbours. The municipal power grid was offline. The radio said the main BC hydro transformers near Prince George had failed under ice load. Emergency services were overwhelmed. Roads were impassable. And worse, fuel was being commandeered by authorities to keep medical and emergency centres operational. That meant if we didn't have fuel, food and shelter sorted, now we weren't going to survive the coming weeks. We made the call to stay at Jules's uncle's cabin up in Cottonwood River Valley. Isolated, but off-grid and outfitted for hard winters. Propane stove, wood heat, gravity-fed spring line. We gathered gear from what homes we could. I'll never forget breaking into my own house just to get my Carhartt cold weather bibs, my Mossberg 500, and a stack of freeze-dried food I kept in the basement. My ex-wife's photo was still taped to the fridge. She'd left for the city years ago. I stood there longer than I should have. The next few days were frantic. We cut and stacked firewood by the ton, used a chainsaw mill to rip makeshift panels for window reinforcement, stripped batteries from ATVs and boats for charging the radio gear and basic lights. Ben built a makeshift wind generator out of a snowmobile fan and PVC blades, but it barely kept up with the LED usage. Temperatures dropped fast. By October 1st, it was hitting minus 30 degrees Celsius at night. Frostbite was a daily concern. We rotated watch shifts in 4-hour blocks. Why? Because people started coming. Not infected, not zombies, just desperate. Some had cars that had run dry of gas. Others had boots not meant for anything below minus 5 degrees Celsius. They came from as far as Prince George, trying to follow rivers or rail lines in the hope of finding shelter. Some we helped, gave them a thermos of broth or wrapped hands in fleece and pointed them east to wells. Others were more dangerous. On October 3rd, a man tried to take our fuel drums, armed with an old hunting rifle, half frozen, starving. Jules talked him down, gave him food even, but we all agreed we needed a perimeter and we needed a plan if things got worse. And they did. It wasn't just the cold, it was the silence that came with it. No birds, no crickets. Even the wolves had moved farther into the forest, searching for prey that no longer migrated. The river near the cabin froze clean through. I knew this because I had to take a chainsaw just to cut out a trench to reach the spring line beneath. One night, October 5th, the propane nearly ran out. I remember the panic in Jules's voice as she tried to light the stove and nothing came out but air. We switched to wood for cooking after that, even though it burned faster and soaked the walls in smoke. We rationed everything, 400 calories per person per day. 1 small cup of hot water in the morning. Coffee was gone. Spirits were hoarded. Ben had 2 bottles of Fireball he wouldn't open unless one of us lost a limb. We didn't just survive that first week, we endured it. And then the blizzard came. It hit on October 9th, just after dawn. Winds from the west blew in with a force that sounded like freight trains grinding through the tree line. Snow came sideways. We lost the antenna tower to sheer wind shear, bent it like tin. By mid-morning, visibility had dropped to less than 2 meters. Looking out the window was like staring into a wall of smoke-white static, only colder, crueler, heavier. Every seam in the cabin leaked air, even with the insulation work we'd done in the days prior. The tarped-over windows groaned under the ice build-up. Snow drifted against the west wall like packed concrete. By late afternoon, we could no longer open the front door without shoveling. Ricky spent 3 hours reinforcing the inside of the door with nailed-in planks and a section of steel plate we stripped from the backup stove. There was no power. The batteries had frozen solid. Ben tried to warm them near the wood stove, using a canvas sack and layers of fleece. But even that didn't help. The LED lanterns gave out by nightfall. We reverted to candles and a single kerosene lamp. And even then, we had to ration the fuel. 1 lamp, 1 fire, 4 people, and a cabin now half buried in snow and wrapped in wind howling like it wanted in. We took turns sleeping near the fire so it wouldn't go out. The woodpile, once stacked 4 feet high and covered with a canvas tarp, was now a frozen block under a drift taller than the shed. Ricky and I spent 2 hours digging it out the next day, hacking at the top layer of ice with a Pulaski axe, cutting through like we were mining for ore. Every stick of dry pine became more precious than gold. I don't exaggerate when I say we were burning a wheelbarrow of wood every 12 hours just to keep the cabin above freezing. The temperature dipped to -47°C the second night. Water jugs inside the cabin partially froze. The frost line inside the pantry crept in like moss, coating the walls, the shelves, even the inside of our boots. We slept in every layer we had, rotated socks every day, and dried our clothes by stringing them over the stovepipe. There were no animals, no movement. Even the tall pines swayed only an inch or two before they locked in place again, encased in ice. We were sealed inside a frozen lung that refused to breathe. When the storm broke 2 days later, the world outside was unrecognizable. The cabin, built on stone footings and raised by nearly a meter, was buried to the windows. The surrounding trees looked shorter, like the land had risen to swallow them. The trucks were gone, the outbuilding collapsed under the snow load, and the woodshed had disappeared entirely. The sky was that sickly grey-blue shade you only see in deep frost, and the sun was just a pale disk behind gauze thick cloud. We stepped outside in a single line, using snowshoes cobbled together from old aluminum frames and salvaged rubber strapping. Ben carried a shovel on a lanyard clipped to his pack. Jules took the .223. The snow was more than 5 feet deep. Not powdery, not soft. It had crusted over with a wind-blown glaze, hard enough to walk on with care, but treacherous with weak spots. We had to feel our way forward with each step like crossing a frozen lake. The radio tower lay snapped in half like a broken matchstick, draped in ice cables that had once been taut guy wires. The battery box was frozen shut. We knew we wouldn't get signal until spring, if spring ever came. Food was now our biggest concern. The canned goods were holding, but we had underestimated how fast 4 people would burn through calories in extreme cold. Each of us was eating 3,000 calories a day and still feeling starved. We needed protein, real meat, and that meant risking a hunting trip. It was a gamble, but doing nothing meant waiting to starve. On October 14th, we loaded our packs with essentials, fire starting kits, knives, a GPS unit that still held a partial charge, 2 rifles, emergency flares, and a wax-sealed paper map of the area. Ricky and I set out east along the old timber access trail, leading toward the Cottonwood River Basin. Our goal was a trapper's hut another 15 kilometers upriver, last used in the 90s but still marked on forestry maps as structure, status unknown. It took us 9 hours to get there. We broke trail through 5 feet of snow, used a plastic toboggan to carry supplies, and stopped every 45 minutes to rest and check for frostbite. The silence was overwhelming. No birds, no animals, no wind. Just the groan of packed snow and the occasional distant crack of frozen trees splitting under pressure. When we reached the hut, we found it partially intact. The roof had sagged, but the stove was usable, and there was still a woodpile out back, buried under nearly 2 meters of drift. We dug it out, fed the stove, and spent the night wrapped in sleeping bags inside our coats. But the hut offered more than shelter. It offered a clue. Inside a rusted metal box behind the stove, Ricky found 6 old steel traps and a paper-wrapped bundle of snares. We set 3 traps near a tree line with tracks, not fresh, but not too old either. Could have been a hare or a lynx. We spent 2 days in that hut eating MREs and boiling snow for water. On the 3rd morning, we got lucky. One of the traps had a snowshoe hare. The meat was minimal, but the calories were everything. It reminded me of stories my grandfather used to tell, about the starvation winter of '52, when even rodents were food. That day, we smoked what little meat we had, made a slow return to the cabin, and marked every trail post and tree on the way back. It was the first food from the wild we'd found in nearly 2 weeks. Back at the cabin, Jules had news. She'd spotted distant figures from the ridge to the west, no closer than a kilometer, moving slowly, not following trails. Could have been another group, could have been scavengers, could have been desperate. There was no knowing anymore. We doubled up the defenses, moved the barrels inside, covered all the windows with slats, and set up a perimeter with fishing line and bells. Not a real deterrent, but enough to warn us if someone came close. We knew we couldn't rely on kindness anymore. Everyone was in survival mode now. On October 17th, everything changed again. The creek that fed the spring line froze to bedrock. We had no water. It took all four of us to rig a pulley sled from the toboggan and cut a new ice well near the riverbed, using axes and chisels to break through the meter-thick ice until we hit flowing water again. The process took 2 full days. We had to keep the hole open by drawing from it twice daily, hauling 20-litre buckets back to the cabin by rope and sled. That kind of work breaks people, especially when there's no margin for error. You slip, you fall in, you don't get out. So we worked in pairs, always tethered to the bank by climbing rope, one watching, one drawing, and a third on standby with thermal blankets. By the end of the week, the cold was no longer something we feared. It was something we understood. It moved with rules. It demanded tribute in time, energy, and pain. It was no longer just weather. It was an entity. On October 21st, the radio crackled again. One short burst of static, then a clear voice. It was a French speaker, Quebecois accent, calling from Post Delta, north of Val d'Or. He gave coordinates, a warning, and a weather report. Another front was coming, a megastorm, 70 hours of snowfall, sustained winds of 100 kilometers per hour, projected arrival in 4 days. It was the first and only warning we would receive. We didn't wait. Every minute counted. We cut more wood, repaired the roof seams with salvaged aluminum sheeting, reinforced the stovepipe with snow blocks to trap heat. Ben even re-rigged the backup generator to run off waste oil, filtered through denim and cheesecloth. It gave us a few hours of electricity at a time, barely enough to charge the radios and run the inverter for lights, but it was something. In these conditions, something was a victory. Jules stayed on watch most of the time, posted in the loft with a pair of Nikon binoculars and a sketch pad where she kept notes, wind direction, cloud movement, changes in the tree line. She had an eye for subtle shifts, trained from growing up in northern Ukraine, where the winters taught you to read snow like a second language. It was her who saw the leading edge of the storm arriving, not as a line in the sky, but as a distortion in the light, a kind of dimming that crept in from the west and swallowed the sun like fog rising off black ice. The temperature dropped to -51 degrees Celsius within 6 hours of that sighting. The wind rose with it, screaming through the trees and across the slope like a living thing. It wasn't just cold, it was crushing. We'd built windbreaks from tarps and firewood stacks wrapped in plastic sheeting, but nothing truly stopped the cold from finding its way in. It pushed through keyholes, cracked wood, even the seams of our boots. You could feel it hunting for skin, like it had purpose. Inside, we sealed every vent and crack with rags and insulation foam we'd scavenged earlier from a derelict hunting lodge. The cabin turned into a sealed box, air thick with smoke from the stove, and the damp exhale of 4 people barely speaking anymore. Not out of conflict, just fatigue, the kind that sits in your bones, deeper than exhaustion, where words become unnecessary. The storm lasted 4 days. The outside world ceased to exist. We took shifts sleeping in 4-hour blocks, constantly feeding the fire and melting snow. The fire never stopped burning. It couldn't. If it did, we'd lose the cabin in under an hour. That was the reality at these temperatures. No margin for mistakes. Jules began coughing on the 3rd day. Not hard, but dry. Persistent. Her nose was bleeding from the dryness. We kept her hydrated, rationed the remaining packets of electrolyte mix, and boiled pine needles to make tea rich in vitamin C. It was a trick my grandfather taught me, one that saved plenty of loggers in the northern bush. long before modern supplements existed. Still, it reminded us how thin the line was between stability and collapse. When the winds finally died down, we dug out. Again, the drift against the cabin had risen to the roofline. We opened the hatch we'd installed in the attic gable and shoveled our way downward like miners clawing up from a cave. The world outside was smoothed over, alien in its silence and scale. Even the trees looked buried now, only the topmost boughs visible. Black needles frosted white and stiff as wire. Our trail to the river was gone. The woodpile had vanished beneath a new crust. The outbuildings were no longer visible. For the first hour we worked, there was no sun, no wind, and no sound beyond our own breathing. The second silence had begun, the one that comes not from absence, but from saturation. When the snow is so deep, so heavy, that it swallows all sound and gives none back. Ben fell through a soft patch near the old fuel drum and bruised a rib. He didn't speak much afterward, not because of pain, but because he knew how close he'd come. If the snow had covered a hole deeper or collapsed a drift around him, he could have been trapped under meters of snow. There would have been no saving him. We moved in pairs from that point forward, always with rope or line clipped between us, always carrying whistles. Food supplies had dropped to less than a week's worth by October the 30th. The hare meat was long gone, and hunting was nearly impossible. Game had either migrated south or burrowed so deep that tracking was pointless. So we did what we hadn't wanted to do. We returned to Quesnel. We left at first light on November 1st, carrying sleds packed with water, a small propane heater, tools, and every container we could use for transport. Jules stayed behind, still too weak from the dry cough. Ricky stayed with her, citing the cold as too risky for his back. Ben and I made the trek. We used a marked trail from the first trip, now more of a suggestion than a path. With the town over 40 kilometers away, we knew we'd need to bivouac halfway. We used the trapper's hut again, reinforced it with snow blocks, and added a makeshift reflector wall for the stove. The GPS worked intermittently, but we trusted our map and compass more. Visibility was variable. Wind chill cut into every gap in our clothing, and each rest stop left our faces stiff with frost. Quesnel was a ghost town. We reached the edge on the afternoon of the third day. The roads were invisible. Buildings collapsed under snow load, and power poles snapped like dry twigs. The only signs of movement were tracks, human ones, leading into some of the houses and out again. Scavengers, survivors, maybe both. We didn't enter the town centre. Instead, we hit 3 known supply caches: the back of the hardware store where propane tanks were kept, the volunteer fire station where we'd found stored jerry cans before, and a small hunting goods store tucked near the river where Ben knew the owner had kept old survival gear. We didn't get much. Some freeze-dried stew packs, 2 gallons of white gas, and an old flintlock rifle with rusted caps, but it was enough. It wasn't until we tried to leave that we ran into trouble. Near the edge of the town, just before rejoining the trail, we spotted 2 figures moving between collapsed houses. They saw us too. One was carrying a hatchet, the other had what looked like a compound bow. They didn't approach at first, just watched. We nodded, cautious, not aggressive, but they started shadowing us from a distance, always behind, never speaking. We increased our pace. 2 hours later, they were still following. At dusk, we made camp in the same hut. We set a perimeter alarm using soda cans and fishing line. Ben kept the rifle at his side the whole night. The men never approached, but in the morning, we found footprints in the snow just beyond the alarm line, closer than they should have been. We didn't wait. We moved fast. The return trip took 2 days. When we arrived at the cabin, Jules looked worse. Her cough had turned into a low rattle. Ricky had done what he could, made steam, pushed fluids, kept the stove running, but there was no medical care, no antibiotics. We boiled water constantly, mixed pine tea, and elevated her head at night. It was all we had. By November 6th, the cold had deepened again, not just in temperature but in presence. The wind had returned, quieter but cutting. The silence remained, heavier than before. Wildlife was gone. Even the sky looked different, lower, greyer, as if the atmosphere had thickened into a ceiling. That night, we sat around the stove and shared the stew pack we'd brought back. It tasted like cardboard, but it was warm. We didn't talk about the men near Quesnel. We didn't talk about what might happen if Jules got worse. We just ate, chewing in silence, staring at the wavering shadow the stove threw on the cabin's wall. In that moment, it wasn't about planning for next week or worrying about what was coming from beyond the tree line. It was about that one small fire, the few degrees of warmth it gave us, and keeping that flame alive through the night. The following morning brought the coldest air we had yet felt. The frost had crept across the floorboards during the night, curling upward along the walls like invasive ivy. The doorframe had to be pried open with a crowbar. Outside, the air shimmered with crystals in the early light, and any exposed skin immediately burned with pain. My beard froze solid within minutes. The thermometer Ricky had nailed to the inside of the cabin window read -55 degrees Celsius. We stopped trusting it after that. It bottomed out, and it was never built to read the kind of numbers we were now living in. Jules wasn't improving. Her cough had turned into wheezing, the kind that doesn't come from the throat but deep in the lungs. We elevated her sleeping bag closer to the stove and kept warm stones wrapped in cloth against her chest at night. Ben and I rotated melting snow and filtering it for clean water, while Ricky managed the wood ration and stove. Even with careful planning, we were burning a quarter of our remaining supply each day. The sled run back to the buried pile behind the shed had become treacherous. One misstep, one collapse under a snow bridge, and whoever fell wouldn't be getting up. We heard the coyotes before we saw them, not howling, not calling to each other, but pacing, sharp paws on packed snow, circling at night. At first we thought it was just wind-carried noise, but then Jules said she'd heard scratching near the corner of the cabin. We set out the next morning and found tracks, light, careful, moving between the trees near the outhouse. They were starving too, just like us. We posted the motion-activated trail cam, an old piece of kit Ricky had used for game watching years ago. That night, the footage showed 3 of them, lean, bone-thin, ears pinned back. One was missing fur on its left flank, likely frostbite or mange. They were watching us, waiting. Food had run out again. There were still emergency rations, 2 high-calorie survival bars, some dried lentils, and half a bag of rolled oats. But they wouldn't last another 3 days at our current burn rate. Worse, Jules had stopped eating altogether. She sipped water when we helped her sit up, but that was it. Her hands were always cold now, even near the fire. Her breath whistled faintly as she slept. It was Ricky who suggested the trip south. We hadn't considered it seriously before. The roads were buried, the snowpack over timber country too unstable to cross on snowmobile, even if we'd had fuel. But he'd studied the older forest roads, the ones built before modern logging operations. Roads that ran parallel to the old railway spur, which itself might lead to Barkerville. The ghost town, turned historic site, had been shuttered for years, but was maintained seasonally by the provincial park staff. It wasn't much, but it was our best shot at finding stored supplies. Fuel, blankets, non-perishables, maybe even medicine. We debated it for hours, quietly, away from Jules, who was too weak to speak now. Ben was against it. Not because he didn't want the supplies, but because he didn't trust the weather to hold. He feared another storm would trap whoever went. I understood his hesitation. Still, we took the risk. Ricky and I packed the sleds again, gathered the map, rifle, emergency flares, and enough food for 4 days, half of what we had left. We left at dawn on November 9th. The cold cracked the snow underfoot like glass. Every breath hurt, even through layered scarves. The sun rose, dim and distorted behind ice fog, casting no warmth. We followed the old route through the pines, passing the skeletal remains of cabins and collapsed bunkhouses from a time when this region bustled with forestry work. All gone now. Swallowed. Even the birds had vanished. By the third day, we reached the outskirts of Barkerville. It was buried almost entirely in snow. Only the peaks of roofs and a few chimneys jutted out like jagged rocks on a frozen shore. The main visitor centre had collapsed inward, but a secondary building, once a maintenance garage, still stood. We dug for hours. Finally, behind a heavy door half frozen shut, we struck gold. Inside were supplies, not much, but enough. Emergency candles, powdered milk, vacuum-sealed soup pouches, 4 tins of corned beef, a first aid box with antibiotics well past their date, but usable, a hand-crank radio still functioning, 2 sealed jugs of kerosene. Most important of all, a solar panel kit for 12V charging. We packed everything we could into the sleds, double-lashed them, and set off immediately. The temperature dropped that night. We bivouacked in a half-buried schoolhouse and took turns keeping the fire alive with dry lath from broken chairs and window frames. When we returned on the 13th, Jules was barely conscious. Ben had done everything he could, wrapped her in every available blanket, rotated warm stones, boiled water constantly. She was alive, but barely. We administered the antibiotics immediately, crushed into warm broth. Her fever broke on the second night. She started speaking again on the third. It was the first true victory we'd had since the beginning. By then, the cold had become a permanent feature. It didn't fluctuate, it just was. We stopped checking the thermometer. What was the point? The snow never melted. The sky remained pale and dry. The sun, when visible, offered no relief. It had become a fixture, like a dim lantern in a cave. Then came the broadcast. On the morning of the 16th, Ben caught a voice on the crank radio. It was in English, clear, official, not local. Repeating emergency bulletin. Northern sectors are under permanent atmospheric freeze. Survivors are advised to seek relocation routes south of the 49th parallel. Federal evacuation centers established near Spokane, Boise, and Salt Lake City. Repeat. The message cut out and looped. But it was confirmation. There were still organized efforts. There were still others out there. But Spokane was over 800 kilometers away, across multiple mountain passes, through an unrelenting freeze and without any reliable roads or fuel reserves. The idea of making that journey seemed impossible. Yet, for the first time, there was direction, a possible goal, something beyond mere survival. It changed the tone inside the cabin. Subtle, but real. We made plans, quietly, methodically, not for a journey the next day or the day after, but maybe when the sun was higher, when the days grew longer again, if they grew longer. We cached supplies, reinforced sleds, began mapping a potential route through the Fraser Canyon. Ricky even modified one of the snowshoes to serve as a crude anchor for rope descents. We weren't naive, but we were no longer frozen in place. Jules began standing again, first for minutes, then hours. She moved slowly, always wrapped in layers, always near the fire, but she smiled now. That mattered. By November 19th, 30 days had passed since the world changed. The last leaves had fallen long ago, buried deep under meters of snow. The winds had stripped the trees bare and turned them into black skeletons against an endless winter sky. But we were still here, still standing. The cold had taken nearly everything, comfort, certainty, even time, but it hadn't taken us. Not yet. And when spring fails to come, we'll keep moving south, not because we expect salvation, but because in a world locked beneath ice, movement is the last proof that we're alive. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.